On a dim Sunday morning, the soft light filtered through the small bedroom window, gliding over the face of 82-year-old Joe Thompson, a black veteran, as he slowly got out of bed. His battle-worn body was now slightly sore, but his eyes were still burning with spirit. A man who had fought to protect his country now still had a strong belief in the future. As the sunlight touched the medals on his jacket, Joe gently bowed his head to each medal, a symbol of past sacrifices. They were more than just metal. They were stories of his comrades, of the front line, of loyalty to the ideals of justice that he and soldiers like him once held dear. He wished that his country and himself would always live up to that belief. For the first time in weeks, Joe decided to go to a new place, Cozy Corner Cafe. The small, simple place was known for its delicious scrambled eggs and friendly atmosphere. He was dressed in a neat suit, his jacket with shiny medals. Everything was definitely pointing towards a peaceful morning. He touched the doorknob. The jingle of the bell made him feel secure. But then when he stepped in, the warm atmosphere immediately had something a little strange. The situation began to change. Shock. In the corner of the shop, cool bikers wearing leather jackets, long hair, somewhat rough, were sipping coffee. Joe was a little confused, but still kept an approachable smile. A young employee named Sarah came and nodded. Very quickly, Joe was led to a booth by the window without any sign of anything unusual. He ordered a special egg dish with lots of bacon while enjoying a cup of fragrant coffee. Everything was normal until the owner, Frank, walked out. From the initially kind gaze when he looked at Joe, his face changed, his ears turned red, his gaze was full of tension. Joe went from feeling welcomed to feeling threatened. All he wanted was breakfast, but he suddenly realized that he was the center of hostility. The feeling of being excluded, of being despised, reached its peak in a moment. Shock, shock. The cafeteria fell silent. Customers turned to look. Sarah was still standing nearby, her hands shaking, not knowing what was about to happen. Frank walked up to Joe's table, his voice angry. "We can't serve you here. Go away." He used the excuse that the cafe is full, even though the seat was empty. Joe knew he was facing blatant racism, even though he had fought under the American flag. He tried to stay calm, but it hurt to his heart. That was the biggest shock. Instead of being respected, he was being seen as not belonging, being excluded because of the color of his skin. He realized a bitter truth. Even at 82 years old, even though he had sacrificed his life for his country, he could still be treated like a second-class citizen. When Frank continued to impose his right to refuse service with the rude words, "That's enough. Gentlemen like you don't need to show up. Don't come." Everyone in the restaurant fell silent. Joe looked around, seeing eyes of refusal, hesitation, anger, and even chaos. Some glanced away, while Sarah bowed her head in shame, not knowing how to react. In that chaotic moment, Joe felt his heart broken, an American symbol who had fought for justice, rejected by the community right where he sought peace. But then a deep sigh rang out from Sarah, as light as the wind. In a moment, she stepped to the table, her eyes still trembling but sincere. Because of the space and the time, she whispered, "You can stay if you want. This bar is for everyone. I'm sorry, I won't ask you to go anywhere." It was a moment of recognition, a small but meaningful change. Sarah looked straight into his eyes, filled with gratitude and respect. The reaction was unexpected. A group of more than a dozen bikers from the corner of the bar stood up and walked toward Frank and Joe, forming a line in the middle. The leader of the group, a tall, bearded, gray-haired man, looked straight at Frank. "I can't believe you would treat a veteran like that," he said, his voice low, restrained but forceful. The other bikers pulled out their veteran cards. They had fought alongside him. The bar fell silent. Even the regular customers began to stir, whispering. Joe was stunned by the scene. He was being recognized here not just as a customer, but as someone who had devoted part of his life to this country. It was a moment of empathy from a community, bikers, veterans, who understood and shared the pain he was feeling. The leader continued, "He has a right to be here like us, like anyone else." Frank was speechless. Blood rushed to his face. He backed away, trembling. Joe stood up, his voice soft but firm. "I don't want to make a scene, but I deserve to be here as much as anyone else." He looked into Sarah's eyes, the biker's, and the customer's eyes, who were slowly coming to his side. His heart sank because what he saw was not denial but struggle. He suddenly understood he was not alone. A community, a collective, was ready to stand by him. Not just sympathy, but active support. That moment created a small turning point. Frank felt paralyzed. The biker showed Frank his VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars, card and said, We fought together. We demanded justice for each other. His voice carried farther out into the shop. The customers fell silent as if waiting. Sarah stood there, her wrist still shaking, but she pulled a piece of paper from the magazine and placed it on the table before leaving. "Serving you, mister. Joe, I take responsibility." The words rang in every earpiece. The atmosphere that had seemed closed at the beginning of the hour suddenly changed, opening a new door. Not just about Joe's personal story, but about a common issue about belief in justice. This moment is reflection, introspection, looking back at oneself. Joe wonders, is everything changing? Is there really a whole community that dares to stand up for him, a man who once fought proudly? Images of the past, the battle far from home, the challenging milestone, the loneliness among foreigners, appear in his mind. He realizes that the values he fought for about equality, honor, responsibility are not just theories. That is why people stand up. He himself thought that his faith had withered, but now it is alive and well. The veteran, the one who was forgotten, now stands in the midst of a powerful community spirit. When Frank steps back, finally nodding reluctantly for Sarah to continue serving, no one can resist anymore. Joe sat down, his hands shaking as he gripped his coffee cup. The biker nodded slightly at him. He suddenly felt. Although the situation had not changed completely, he was back in the midst of his community. He began to expect something to grow, hope, a small ray of light, but enough to dim the darkness that still lingered. He took the first bite of the egg. The egg was gentle, but it tasted of freedom. The conversation gradually returned to the shop, softer. Sarah sat down next to Joe. He asked, "Are you okay?" She trembled. "I am sorry. I suddenly realized that I used to want to serve people." Joe smiled. "It's okay, I just hope." He hesitated. "We feel that we are not alone." Around, customers were still talking softly, their eyes curious but no longer tense. Joe felt his heart beat with each beat as when he was young. He understood. He was witnessing a small but extraordinary moment. A brave community, not just bikers, but ordinary people who can ask the question, "Am I right?" and can actually stand up for what is right. Finally, action, concrete action, happens. The bikers stand around Joe like a shield. Their leader, Mike, turns to all the customers in the cafe and says loudly, "Today we are not just here for Joe, but for a better future. If anyone tries to imitate him, we are here." This is a strong declaration of war, not by force, but by presence. They use popular power to protect justice. Joe finishes his coffee, stands up. He approaches Frank softly. "Thank you for letting me stay. I will not leave again." Frank nods again, silent. Joe walks out the door. The bikers help him out and sit behind. Before getting in the car, Joe looked back at the small shop. The seemingly peaceful place had now changed forever, because of one morning when he dared to speak the truth. As the bikers, Harley turned onto the quiet road leading back to their hometown. Joe sat quietly behind, his hands no longer shaking, but his heart filled with deep emotion. After the rescue at Cozy Corner, the seemingly ordinary Sunday morning had turned into the beginning of something big, an emotion both light and heavy with thought. His heart felt like it was rekindled with hope, while the memory of the battle carried an indelible wound. The long drive brought them to a small roadside cafe with a sign that said peace. No one said much, but Joe felt each biker listening to his breathing. Mike turned to him, his voice soft. "We know you need a peaceful place after this morning. This is a good place to think things over." Joe nodded, a sense of peace spreading. Each grain of sand from the previous day's memory gradually lost its intensity to give way to calm, meditative calm. Over his second cup of coffee, Joe lost himself in thought. The life of a soldier, the journey of serving his country, and the unjust injustices of the society he once defended. It wasn't just about being kicked out of the coffee shop. It was about the deep rift in society, where the elderly and people of color still had to fight to live fully. He suddenly realized that yesterday wasn't just a personal matter. It was the starting point of a larger story, the story of a society that had to find justice by truly standing up. While Joe was lost in thought, Mike and a few other bikers spoke quietly to each other, looking at him with sincere, respectful eyes. The group leader slowly said, "This isn't just about saving one person. This is how we protect what we fight for: equality, dignity, human value." They talked about standing together on the battlefield, hearing the gunshots, seeing the blood of their comrades, and vowing not to let injustice triumph when they returned home. Joe sighed, and for the first time in years, he felt truly not alone, a community standing behind him. In the quiet of the morning, Joe's phone rang. It was a text from his daughter. "Are you okay?" The paper is asking. They want to say something. He choked up. The screen seemed to reflect the events of the day. The local paper was doing an interview about the racist incident at Cozy Corner and the outpouring of support that had erupted across the country. He answered softly, "I'm okay. I'll think about it seriously, thank you all." Softly, as he had chosen not just to talk but to act. Back at the table, Joe said to Mike, "What should we do tomorrow?" The biker leader smiled and replied, "We need to turn this morning's gesture into a broader campaign. Not just a morning of anti-racism at the coffee shop, but a series of talks, seminars for people to hear about the trenches, about joining forces, about how we can no longer accept injustice." Joe nodded. He thought of veterans groups, communities of color, disadvantaged youth. They needed to know they were not alone. A moment later, Joe suddenly shared a personal story. About the time he waited tables at a restaurant when he first returned from the battlefield, hearing derogatory comments even before wearing his medals. About the time his wife, a black education counselor, was rejected from teaching in middle school because of the color of her skin. About the time he had to witness his daughter being discriminated against by her classmates at school. All of it was like a cluster of thorns in his memory. But they never allowed those causes to define the value of his life. So yesterday, with the first cup of coffee, today is the second voice, and soon is the community campaign, the action to let others know. We still have to engage. When the cup of coffee was empty, the sun was a little higher. The soft yellow light spread across the street. Mike stood up, raised his cup high. "Thank you for what you did yesterday, Dad. Thank you for standing up when many people tried to be silent." Mike continued, "This action is an example for the younger generation. They are looking at us. They need to know who can join their heads and who will stand up." Joe felt the importance of the small collision the day before. It was not just his own story, but the story of a society that was gradually realizing that all senses were wrong when they were silent. Leaving the W peaceful, they stopped for a moment by the Central Park. Joe watched a group of children playing public basketball, yellow, white, black playing together, laughing together. He smiled, feeling a surge of life flowing through the silence that had just been broken. "I used to think I was old and had no strength to save anything," he said. "But it turns out that something as small as this morning can cause an earthquake in people's hearts." Mike nodded. "If one person stands up, the others will follow. The dominoes start falling from one." Joe looked up at the blue sky as if he were relieved. "I'll join in. I'll tell this story in schools, in clubs, in veterans organizations." The bikers looked at each other and smiled. They pulled Joe onto their bikes and took him for a ride around the city, where they had ridden a few years ago, when they had gathered to remember their fallen comrades. The march was not just yesterday, but soon, a series of places they would visit to tell the story of today. Every heel pressed, every wheel turned, a reminder that today's action must continue, must reach everyone, every home. When the caravan stopped in front of the local Veterans Association, Joe got out with Mike. They went into a small meeting room which was filled with photos of generations of soldiers. Joe told the leader, "I want to do an open talk, invite the community to listen, to talk. Yesterday was personal, but today it's our story." The leader smiled, touched his shoulder lightly. "That's absolutely right. We need to turn injustice into inspiration for change." Joe took a deep breath, his eyes shining with determination. "I'm going to tell everything. I want the whole town, the whole state, to know that an old man, a man of color, still deserves respect." The next day, the local paper published an interview with Joe and Mike. They wrote, "From the shock of inactivity to the movement of unity, the story of Joe Thompson, 82-year-old veteran, widely supported by bikers and the community, opens a necessary social dialogue about racism." In every line, in every headline, his story could spread, stirring the sleeping consciousness of the people. They could see themselves in Frank's betrayal and realize that standing still was also standing on the side of injustice. That night, Joe went home full of emotion. He sat on the porch, looking up at the starry sky. His heart ached with the familiar truth, but mixed with the small joy of words of encouragement. "Yesterday I was cast out," he wrote in his diary. "Today I stand up, people see me, and from there I will tell them more. Yesterday's actions were only the beginning. The road ahead is long, but I do not walk it alone." Frank Morrison, the owner of Cozy Corner, couldn't sleep that night. The image of Joe rising from his table, walking silently past the indifferent stares of his customers, burned into his mind like an indelible stain. He should have been proud of keeping the peace, as he had thought for years, but this time was different. There was something about the way Joe looked at him, not anger, not defiance, just the look of a man who had seen too much. Frank had seen that look before in wartime photos in the face of his father, a veteran of Korea. And it scared him, not of Joe, but of himself. The news spread like wildfire. Social media went viral with a video of the bikers returning to the bar, standing up for Joe. The hashtags were, "Justice for Joe, vet deserves respect, cozy no more." Frank became a symbol of segregation of a time America was trying to escape. The next morning, the Cozy Corner sign was graffitied. "This is not cozy for all." A middle-aged white man, once respected by the town, now a symbol of backwardness and indifference. But something inside Frank was breaking. It was no longer anger or defensiveness, but recognition that he had played a role in a larger tragedy. And strangely, sympathy came from where he least expected it, his ex-wife, Mary. After seeing the news, she came knocking on the door, carrying a box of gingerbread cookies that Joe had loved, what he used to call the old men's cookies. Frank sat silently, holding the cookie in his trembling hand. "You were a good man, Frank," Mary said. "You said if your father were alive, you would never let a veteran be disrespected. What about Joe?" The words were like a blow to Frank's chest. He remembers the first time he opened the shop, when Joe was one of the first customers, bringing a wartime photo to show everyone. Then Frank smiled and shook his hand. Now he was the one pushing Joe away from the very place he had once welcomed. Frank felt small, insignificant in the shop he had built. On the other side of town, Joe started Respect and Coffee, a series of community conversations with veterans, young people, and business owners. He didn't just tell his story, he listened. Black girls told of being turned away for interviews because of their curly hair. Latino boys told of being looked at suspiciously when entering a convenience store. Each story a piece of the puzzle of subtle discrimination that many people had ignored. And in each conversation, Joe told Frank, not to condemn but to emphasize, people can be wrong, but they can also change. We just have to give them a chance to look back. The words echoed back to Frank like a final confession. One night, he knocked on the door of the Veterans Association where Joe was leading a talk. No one greeted him. Everyone was silent. Eyes were wary. Joe walked out, the light falling on his old face, his eyes tired. But he didn't turn away. He pulled out a chair and invited Frank to sit. The room held its breath. And Frank, in a hoarse voice, said something he never thought he would say in front of a crowd. "I was wrong. Not just wrong with Joe, but wrong with who I used to be." That sentence did not erase the past, but created a present worth starting from. From that day on, Frank closed Cozy Corner for a week, not to hide, but to rebuild. He took down all the old signs, invited a young artist to repaint the facade with the message, "A place for all." On the day of the reopening, he invited Joe to cut the ribbon. Joe, still wearing his old army jacket, stepped up and shook Frank's hand. The camera captured the moment, and the image spread like magic. Two men, a shared past, a clear mistake, and a future that could be healed. But the journey didn't stop there. Joe asked Frank to be a guest at an upcoming community dialogue. Frank agreed. He talked about growing up in a conservative Southern family, how he believed stereotypes were tradition, and how he had come to realize that tradition wasn't something that could be changed, but something that needed to be re-examined in the light of the times. Every word he spoke was an apology. Every nod from the audience was a sign of forgiveness. Joe and Frank then co-wrote an article which was distributed to the media. Respect is a two-way road. The article wasn't just a retelling of the incident, but a call for local businesses to retrain their employees on etiquette and community values. The whole town seemed to slow down. People looked at each other more closely, asked more questions, and the Cozy Corner, once a symbol of division, now hosts a human rights class for teenagers. Brooksville's anniversary took place on a sunny Saturday afternoon, one of those rare days when people put aside their tensions and conflicts to come out and celebrate life. In the festive atmosphere, there was an outdoor stage, twinkling flags, baked goods, and a display of historical photos. Among the black and white photos of lumberjacks, farmers, and veterans from all over the years, a new photo was quietly taped to the right corner, near the makeshift coffee shop. Joe and Frank shaking hands in front of Cozy Corner under the new "A Place for All" sign. There was no red ribbon, no flashy caption, but those who knew, who had witnessed the event that had stirred the town, stood for a long time. There was silence in their gazes, and a sense that something in this town had truly changed. Frank stood in a hidden corner of the festival, not stepping on stage, not speaking. He just stood there watching Joe from a distance as he chatted with a few young men in veteran jackets, listening to them share their plans for a monthly Talks That Heal program. Frank didn't interrupt. There was no need to be the center anymore. Redemption, he understood, didn't have to be grand. It had to be patient. His ex-wife, Mary, smiled at him for the first time in years, not because she forgave him completely, but because she saw that he had truly changed. "You still can't bake," she teased, "but at least you know how to do the right thing." That evening at the Cozy Corner, a cafe turned community center, there was a special screening of Letters from Home, a documentary about Black veterans who had been forgotten in history. Joe invited Frank to sit in the front row. When the scene reached the part where a soldier described being refused service at a diner in full uniform, Frank took a deep breath. No one told him what to say. No one looked at him as guilty, but he knew the past that once made him proud had been silent in the face of injustice. And now he was no longer silent. After the screening, a girl of about 10 years old approached Joe. She was the daughter of African immigrants. She asked, "Uncle Joe, if my friends laughed at me because of the color of my skin, what should I do?" The question was like a knife that pierced all the civilized makeup that society tried to build. Joe bent down, touched her shoulder. "You don't have to do anything to be accepted. Just remember that your worth is not in the eyes of others." She nodded, took Joe's hand, and turned away. Frank stood at a distance, shedding tears. Because he knew, once upon a time, he had been one of those eyes. A week later, Frank sent a handwritten letter to each of the city council members, a proposal that the town host a silent history program, a program that chronicled the stories that had been left out of school textbooks. Black people who built bridges, taught, fought in wars, but were not honored. No one expected Frank to be the one to suggest it, but that was what made the proposal acceptable. At the public meeting, Frank stood up, his voice trembling but firm. "I used to think history was something that could not be changed, but I was wrong. History is what we choose to tell, and I choose not to be silent anymore." Joe was the guest of honor at the project's opening ceremony. He didn't speak long, just one sentence. "We can't change what happened, but we can live so that we don't repeat it." Then he handed the microphone to the young people, new voices, different but valuable memories. Change doesn't come from one big shift, but from hundreds of small moments. A coffee shop changing its name, a man admitting his mistakes, a veteran choosing to tell his story rather than walk away. Brooksville didn't become a paradise immediately. There was still conflict, still deep-seated prejudice. But one thing was certain: silence was no longer an option. And at Cozy Corner every Sunday morning, Frank still poured Joe coffee, no longer as a way to atone, but as a reminder that if the heart was open enough, a person and a community could be healed.